Okay, so one of the things that we really need to think about is communication. And I always think that communication is probably something that we take for granted, in the sense that many of us have, once we were born, we learnt to communicate from our parents, we copied our parents, it's a lot of learned behaviour. And it's probably one of the things that we tend to take for granted, that we should think about more. So if we think about how we communicate, the question I often ask people is, how do we communicate both socially and at work? I suppose the things that most of the time that people will come up with is that we communicate verbally, or as I always put, through sound. In other words, we talk, we listen. I guess you could argue that we talk, we don't listen. Of course, it's not just what we say, but it's the way we say it. So it's things like our tone of voice. It's things like the speed, the pitch. It could also be things like accents and dialects. We also communicate through sight. We see things in writing, we see emails, we see text, and of course we see people's body language. So people often say to me, what is body language? And I guess depending on how you want to break this down, body language really falls into 5 key areas. And first of all, we're talking about facial expression, so things like eye contact, smiling, frowning, those gestures that sometimes are called micro gestures that we give off facially. The next area that we tend to call body language is our posture, the way we stand, the way we sit, probably more importantly the change in posture, movement. Also gesticulation, what we do with our hands and arms. We also class body language in the way of our appearance, often called controlled body language because we have much more control over it than things like our facial expression. And that is of course because this morning you would have chose what you were going to wear for this session, as indeed I chose what I was going to wear for this recording. And the last thing that we tend to call body language is the personal space in which we allow ourselves and other people, sometimes called proximity. And of course all of these things are very much culturally influenced. So for example, the amount of eye contact that we give people can vary very much on things like our cultural background. So for example, typically somebody from the West like myself would probably give high levels of eye contact. If I was showing people that I was listening, I was paying attention, I would probably pay attention roughly 75% of the time by using my eye contact. I will break eye contact roughly every 4 to 6 seconds by blinking or looking away because I don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. Gesticulation, again, is something that's very culturally influenced. In certain cultures, they tend to use their hands less to express themselves, and this would have certainly been true a couple of generations ago in the UK, and we would have often said people from places like the Mediterranean would use their hands a lot to express themselves. And the other thing that we might class as very culturally influenced is things like proximity, personal space. So again, as somebody with my background, been brought up in the UK most of my life, I've lived in the UK, and so I tend to like my own personal space, and without thinking about it, I suppose a metre is my midpoint, roughly an arm's length. And again, in other cultures it could be a lot less than that, it could be half that distance or perhaps even less. You could argue that face-to-face we also communicate through touch, and in a business situation that may be something like a handshake, it may be putting our hand on somebody's shoulder to show things like support. You could argue that we do communicate through smell, and smell is often classed as one of the most powerful forms of communication, but most of it is subconscious. And without going into too much detail, of course, if we were talking to somebody who had body odor issues, then chances are we'd be thinking more about getting out of their way rather than actually listening to them. And of course you could argue that in this day and age that we wear things like perfumes and aftershaves, not only because it's seen now as being much more socially acceptable, but it's also a way of projecting a particular image to the world. And again, you could, in certain situations, argue that we do communicate through taste. And if you think about being hospitable to people, offering people coffees, drinks, things to eat, that can be a great way of trying to build a rapport with somebody. And if you think about communication in its very broadest sense, I would argue that communication at the end of the day is all about communicating concepts or mental pictures. In other words, I've come here today with certain ideas, certain views, certain attitudes, certain experiences that I want to communicate to you using a video recording. It starts off, if you like, as an idea in my head, a concept, a view. Now, I don't have a particular script that I use, although the more I do this, I tend to have my sort of repartee, the stories that I use, etc., etc. But the only way I can communicate to you what's going on in my head, I would argue, is by using the 5 senses. And so I will say things to you in certain ways. I will try to vary the pitch and the speed within my voice. I might sometimes say things that are a little bit more light-hearted to get a humorous response. Sometimes I might be a bit more of a devil's advocate to try and challenge a response or get somebody to explain themselves deeper. I may shake people's hands when I first meet them. Smell, well, I certainly had a shower this morning and put on some aftershave, but of course you wouldn't notice that on the video recording. And of course, typically, I'm sure if I was there in person, then you would be offering me a coffee and refreshments. The person who is listening would take those senses, they would decode them based on their perceptions of their cognition, their view of the world, things like culture, etc., etc. And then they would build up their own mental picture based on what you think or what they think I've communicated to them. And surprise, surprise, it's not always going to be the same. But the question I would ask is, how many times do we say things and assume that other people have understood us? Or how many times do people say things to us, and rather than asking for clarification with a few questions, then we just take it at face value. And just a final thing to think about, the question I always ask people is, in a typical face-to-face situation, and that's always very hard to explain, but would we communicate more verbally or non-verbally? Well, there's always arguments for each side of this, but if you think back a couple of generations, then we were less aware of things like body language, and we were probably more aware of what we were saying and the way we were saying it, or perhaps less so the way we were saying it. Currently, I guess a lot of people will probably suggest that around 7%, which isn't a large amount, of what we communicate that influences other people, and that's the key thing that influences other people, are probably words that we use. Only around 7%. It's often argued that around 13% is through the tone, the intonation, the meaning behind the words, the way we say things, and of course that leaves 80% of what we communicate to non-verbal, and most of that is body language. And of course, bearing in mind we can't choose when we communicate,